Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Writing Visual Studio Extensions with Mads. That's me. And as always, we have James producing. Hello, James. How are you doing?
That's me. I'm doing fantastic. I'm learning about system diagnostics trace. It's very exciting.
Learning something new?
It's funny because, it's like you've used system console, system debug, and then I was writing this document, this learn module, and I'm like, for some reason, I don't know how anything works. So it's so much fun to actually go back to the beginning and back to the basics and learn, wow, I should have been using this stuff all along. Just like watching you build this stuff. I should have been using your stuff all along, Mads.
I agree. And I think today we have a show that I think you're going to like, James, because it's about JSON Schema. And people might think, well, that's boring. XML schemas, blah. I've done that in the past. I remember SOAP. It was XML. It was schema. It was heavy. Forget all that. JSON Schema is where it's at. And so I want to get into, first of all, kind of just show very briefly what it is. And also we're gonna just do a quick example of writing a simple one. But there's a couple of ways we can ship JSON schemas with our extensions. And I'm going to go through that. And what's really cool is that we can then provide IntelliSense and validation, all sorts of things for JSON formats. Any JSON file you can apply programmatically this schema to. And that's going to be super helpful. And so let's just go straight to the screen here. James, can we see my screen? Yep. And I'm just going to start fresh. We're going to do a new what are we going to do? We're going to do a new V6 project. We're just going to do let's see the standard one here. Hey, Alex. I see Alex says hey. And Laurent, hello. I did that wrong. Is it Laurent? It's like French pronunciation. Okay. V6. Let's call this JSON Schema sample. Why not? You only live once. Not Visual Studio Code is the question here. Yes, this will work in Visual Studio Code as well. Haha. And I can tell you a story. I will bring out my pipe, and I think this should be my storytelling prop. I'll tell you the story of JSON Schema and how Visual Studio revolutionized the use of JSON Schema. It sounds unlikely, but it is true nonetheless. Okay. Here's how I like to do it. I like to create a folder called JSON because I don't know why. And I'm going to just put a file in there. So we're going to call this test.json. So I want sort of think of this as this is my example file. This is this is my file. Now I want a schema file too, and I'm going to call this test/schema.json. Now, the file names here don't matter at all. It doesn't have to be -schema. That doesn't mean anything. It's just a naming convention that I kind of like. So test is my instance document. So this is what we call it internally. We call it the instance document. And so if you want to follow along with this, you need the JSON editor installed. And I do believe that, so if you just have, let's say, the desktop client, the desktop workload of .NET, for instance, installed with Visual Studio, you do not necessarily have the JSON editor. So one way to get the JSON editor is to get the ASP.NET and web development. It's weird, I know. It's weird that because JSON has nothing specifically to do about web, right? And anyone can use JSON, but we have to go get it in here. We could get a smaller component, and it's called something web tools. If we were to get the smallest package available that has it, then it might be this one, web development tools plus .NET Core 2.1. So if you don't want the whole ASP.NET web workload, you can just go to individual components and grab the web development tools. And you need that for the JSON editor to exist. And that's what we got here. Steven, nice to see the garage getting tidier by the week. Thank you. Yeah, still got some mess going on here, but that's only till next time. So next time we meet, this is going to be all clean and nice. Okay, so let's say we have a simple JSON file, and this has a few properties. Let's say it has run, true, and test can be, let's say it can be on, like on or off, something like that, or status, like state, right? It's on or off. So let's say I want to provide IntelliSense for this document. Well, I'm going to go to my schema. And the first thing I'm going to do is to define this JSON document as a schema. I do that by hitting $schema, and check this out. Look, I get IntelliSense here. A lot of things. I want to use draft 4 schema. Like that. It's going to complain about something. I don't know about that. We're going to give it a title. Something. Whatever. You don't have to. And then I'm going to say properties. Notice here I get IntelliSense for writing a JSON schema. That IntelliSense came here. Because I added this schema file right here, I get IntelliSense. Okay? I didn't have to do that. I could use the drop-down list on top of the editor and select a schema instead. You see, there's like a lot here. Okay? There's many, many different. So I'm getting IntelliSense now in validation for JSON schema for the draft 4. And draft 4, we have to do draft 4 for Visual Studio. That's the version it understands. There's some newer drafts like draft 7 and draft 9, but they don't really have anything interesting. So just keep the draft 4. That's not true. They do have interesting things. But you can pretty much express anything you want in V4. Okay. Okay, let's take this question. When will comments finally be supported in JSON, though? Like these? Or is it more like these? So they're already supported. Now you might say, well, no, they're not. They're not part of the blah blah. And that's true. However, here's what it says. Here's what the JSON standard says. It's not really a standard in that sense, but here's what defines it. So JSON, defines the minimum valid things that describes what JSON is. So that's, I think, the Douglas Crockford JSON RCF or whatever. But it says that any client can support additional things. Okay, so comments is not a part of the original small little tight definition of what JSON is, but any client can choose to expand on what it supports as long as it supports the bare minimum. Okay, so if your JSON file is going to be used as data transfer on a web API, let's say REST API, then no, comments are not supported. However, if your JSON is going to be used as a config file or data storage, and the client that reads it, is JSON.NET, for instance, like Newtonsoft JSON in the .NET world, or it's Visual Studio, then yes, comments are supported. I hope that answers your question. There's nothing wrong with comments, but when you do that, you don't have full interoperability. You need the smallest definition of what JSON means to do that. But if you don't need that, it's kind of like Net Standard. You can support Net Standard if you want to make sure you work on cross-plat and all that sort of stuff. But if you're building a Visual Studio extension that only works on Windows, there's no reason to do .NET Standard, let's say, because it's never going to be used in those other on those other platforms. So it doesn't matter. So yeah. Okay, so we're going to define a property called run, and it's of type Boolean, like that. And we can give it a description and say, this is something. Great description. And then we have one more, and it was, what do we call it? Status. So I actually don't have to type in quote. I can just do status and then colon. And that automatically puts the quotes and everything for me. Status. And in here, we said it can be on or off, right? Or maybe it can be null too. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. We're going to do type. And then we're going to do array. And we're going to say it can be an enum. Oh, sorry. It can be a string. Or it can be null. Like that. And then we can say enum. So on, off, null. What is this complaining about? Maybe, you know, we actually don't need a type here at all. That's why. Because we already defined what's valid right there. And we can give that a description saying something about another description. Okay, so now I have my JSON schema. So now I need to apply it to this one. Now, one way I can do that is that I can do schema, say test-schema.json. I forgot the quotes. Oh, like that. Oh, comma. I may have to probably close it and reopen it for that to work. Is that right? What is it complaining about? The type of schema is not supported. Doing something wrong? I don't know. Is there a good tool to create a schema from a JSON file? Samuel asks. Well, you know what? I actually had an extension out. It wasn't me who wrote it. It was one of my colleagues for Visual Studio 2013. It's probably still in the marketplace. So if you have 2013, then go check that out. Okay. So it still says something wrong. Now you can see it pops up here. So I can actually remove this. And I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna go to schemastore.org because something was up with let's go look at the app settings. I forgot this very important little silly thing to forget. There we go. Now it's gone, and now you can see here we get there we go. You can see here. You see, I get quick info telling me about the description, what type it is. And if I were to type in here, see, I get IntelliSense. True. And down here, I get IntelliSense as well. And of course, if I do something that I'm not supposed to, I get a squiggle, right? So I get validation as well. So this is really, really helpful. So let me show you something you may not know about. So how do you assign a schema? Well, you can just type any URL up here and Visual Studio will automatically download it. But if you have the file on hand, so here, for instance, I have the file right here. I can just drag it up into the drop down here. Well, I used to. They've removed that feature? Oh! Okay, well, in this case, I could just type it. I could just type it in, right? Test JSON. That's probably what I want to do here. And you might think, well, what about next time I open the solution? Well, let's try that, shall we? Can it remember that that is now mapped? Okay. Should null strings be empty strings? Jonas asked. Well, that's up to you. You define what the format is. Okay, so now when I open test, I need the test schema to still be applied, and it is. You see up here, and why is that? Because if we just open the csproj file, and then we look for test schema. Here. I'll bet you had no idea that this was a thing. So check this out. Project extensions, Visual Studio, user properties. It's automatically written here. Isn't that amazing? So that's actually, so under the hood, you can do the same. You can store properties like name value pairs the same way in your own extensions. That's exactly how the implementation here is done too. So if you use the DTE, the env DTE, I can show you, I guess. But there's a property hanging off of the DTE called globals. So dte.globals.add, and it writes it in here. That's just a little, very not well-known thing. I think actually most of the engineers on the Visual Studio team might not know about that thing. But you've probably never seen it before, and because it's not really used. So, okay, so now we know how locally we can apply a JSON schema to a file to get IntelliSense. Okay, but what I really want, is that I have a file here called Txt Json. Now let's say that this file was a property, and I gave it a name such that it would always, like any file that had this name, should always follow the schema. So for instance, if I have a file called bundleconfig.json, so it's one I use in one of my old extensions, bundleconfig.json, I want it such that whenever someone opens a file called bundleconfig.json, I want them to get IntelliSense and validation. So how do we do that? Well, there's two ways. I'm going to show the sort of the cross-platform way, and then I'm going to show the Visual Studio way afterwards. So the cross-plat way is to go to schemastore.org. This is a website that hosts JSON schemas. Check this out. See how many there are. There's all sorts of stuff, from GitHub to Azure specific things to Visual Studio things to, like, you name it. Package to NPM, like all sorts of things. Everything that has a JSON format is defined in here, including some WC3 standards, like the web app manifest is actually defined in Schema Store of all places, even though it's a W3C thing. And what's really cool is that any editor that interfaces with or that supports Schema Store will automatically get this file matching between, let's say, bundleconfig.json and the schema. So if I open bundleconfig.json, look at this. Here's a bundleconfig.json file. Okay. So I uploaded this file to schemastore.org, and I've registered it such that whenever I open a bundle config, it applies this schema. So we go to GitHub, and we can see here how that mapping is done. So API, JSON, catalog. So this is a big file, but here we can see how it's done. So here's one entry. Zoom in here a bit. It has a hard time zooming in. I think it's the page is too heavy here. See the scroll bar? Whoa. This is fine. Let's just use this one. So here it says, whenever you open a file called galaxy.yaml, then automatically apply the schema in this URL. And most schemas are actually uploaded to schemastore.org, but you can host them yourself on your GitHub repo or whatever you want. As long as it's in here in this catalog file, all these different editors such as Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio for Mac, I think IntelliJ and sort of the JetBrains IDs as well, and a bunch of others. They will automatically apply this schema, your schema, to a file. So that's kind of cool, right? So basically what we have to do is we have to go in here, and then we go into source, schemas, JSON, and we add our JSON file in here. Okay? Add your JSON file in here. That will automatically give it a URL. So once it's in here, 5 minutes later, it becomes public on the website. And so let's take this API builder. So the API builder will then become, I can remember it. So it will basically be json.schemastore.org/API builder. This is HTTPS. Here it is. Okay, so that's going to be the URL. So you take that URL and you put that into the catalog file that we just saw, which is just alphabetically sorted. So then you go in here and you make a pull request to the catalog. Of course, you just do one pull request because you know what the URL is going to be because it's the same as the file name without the .json after it. And then you go in here, alphabetically find where you need to be, and then you just enter your thing. And you can have a file match here. You don't have to. If you have a file called something like settings.json, that is just not very unique. You need to have a unique name. Don't use a generic name like manifest.json, settings.json, those type of things. So remember that. And so done. Okay, we're done now. Once you send a pull request to this repo, that's all you need to do. And so that's very cool. But there are some schemas that are used for internal use only, or it's like, well, they're useless unless you have Visual Studio installed anyway, and your extension that does things. Okay, let's see here. What is the question here? Are Microsoft Common Data Services database schemas available somewhere? I don't even know what that is. So my answer is I don't know. Sorry. Okay, so what I want to do now, let's say I have an extension and I want to ship a schema file. I want to ship this one so that anytime someone opens any file called test.json, this schema should apply, okay? So here's what I will do. I'm going to add a new file. I'm going to call it, well, hang on. I bookmarked something because I forgot how to do it. So we're actually going to go explore something together. Yeah. So here it is. So here I found an old version of bundler minifier where I have the it's called the schema selector, and I have how to do it. So I'm just gonna copy all that stuff. But we don't know what DLL it's in, so we have to go discover that. I'm gonna say here my JSON schema selector.cs. It's actually my test schema, right? Test schema selector. There we go. And this is namespace here is JSON schema sample. There it is. Okay, so let's see here. It can't find this one. That's expected. Oh, it's looking for Microsoft.json.core.schema. So check this out, people. We're now going to do something that is usually or always something that we do not recommend that you do. And that is to use internal APIs. Don't do it. Now I'm going to show you how. So what is an internal API? Well, if the API in Visual Studio is not contained in a NuGet package that's available on nuget.org, right, then it's not for public consumption, meaning there's no guarantees that it won't change. There's no guarantees that it's not going to stop tomorrow working, and that you might, if you use it, it might crash Visual Studio, worst case scenario, right? But this particular one has been stable for 5 years or so. So I know that this is relatively safe to use. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said that it was probably okay. However, we need to find it. And this was done a long time ago. They actually updated the namespace since. So that's one of those breaking changes that would have made this whole thing break down, right? So now we have to go explore. So let's go explore Visual Studio. And we need to find something. So I don't really know what to search for. So I think Microsoft JSON. So I think it has something to do with, I think there's JSON in it and then some DLL. So let's just see what we got. Well, we got a lot. And it's probably called something about Microsoft, the web. No. Where are you? Really? If I just do dot on this one, no, it can't. Okay. So I missed it, I'm sure. But I need to find all the web ones. So let's look for the one called something with CSS. It would be next to it. Yeah, I think it would be here. Open file location. JSON. Oh, it was, okay, that's fine. So I don't know which one here we need. So let's just go in here and add reference, and we're gonna browse. And we just do one, let's do, it's probably the editor. It could also be VS. I think it's editor. Let's see here. Anything? Generate? No. We also need system component model. System component model, composition. And then we need, let's do the other JSON one, JSON VS. Let's see here. Let's see if this helps. They might also have renamed it. Okay, so let's see, what could it be? It's called as Microsoft dot web tools dot languages dot JSON dot editor dot not completion. It could be document. I would have expected to say something about schema. No, you know, it could be the last one that's there. JSON. Is it not possible to add this in a NuGet package is the question? No, or sorry, is the type that we're going to use here not possible to add to NuGet? Yes, it is. It is totally possible. Okay, here, schema. JSON schema selector. Okay, here we go. It is possible, but the teams don't do that unless they're sure that they have a stable and good API. And I think actually it is pretty good, but for some reason they haven't prioritized it. And you know, that's also, once they put it out there, they have to be backwards compatible with it for like forever, right? And so it's a big thing to do, to put something out there. Okay, so what do we want this file name to be? So we said, whenever you open test.json, let's see here what the interface tells us to do. Let's just see, yeah. I just go to definition. So we have an event handler, which we don't need. Get schema for gives us the full path. And then we need to return a list of the schemas, because it should be that we wanted to add it to this list up here, right? So we need to tell it the list of schema files that we're going to provide, and we do that here. So that means that we're going to go to disk to find the schema, which means we have to ship the schema in the v6. So we go properties on the schema and make sure we set this to content, and then include in v6 should be true. You know, you can double click on these, right, to change the value. Just in case you didn't know. You know that, James? You're not even paying attention.
I'm totally paying attention. I did not know that you could click on that. I swear I'm paying attention. I was trying to figure out how not to put my face back on the screen. I had to click on 20 buttons. I was like, oh, what am I doing?
Okay. So I like to put the settings here instead of going tools, options. I just have an icon right here. But it's the same thing is true in here. So if you go in, you can double click these. This is the property grid. Double click, changes them. So if you have an enum value, it just cycles through them. So there you have it, folks. Someone to ask about system.text.json. No, that has nothing to do with, this is completely different from system.text.json. This is a Visual Studio concept. It is not a .NET framework or a .NET Core class library type of thing. It is very much a Visual Studio thing to map a file to a schema that is shipped in an extension. That is a very hard Visual Studio problem to solve. Or not that the problem is hard, but it's hardcore or whatever. It doesn't apply anywhere else. It only applies to Visual Studio. Okay, so we need to test this. Oh, I forgot one thing. I'm doing MEF, right? I'm exporting this as MEF. And when we're doing MEF, we have to go in and say that we are now also, our extensions is now also a MEF component like this. Oh, okay. So now we can build, compile and run. So now there's conflicts about something. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. This is because I'm using an internal build of Visual Studio. It's complaining about these things because that internal, I just took an internal component and actually I'm going to do something else. I'll show you how to ship and how to deal with an internal component. I really shouldn't. Okay, so now let's just open like some solution here. My language, V6 Project 1. So now if I create a file called test.json here in this particular random project. Let's see here. Did it just crash on me? Why did it crash? It had nothing to do with the extension, by the way. I was calling on another extension. Oh, I opened the wrong one. No, hang on. Yeah, that's a good one. So let's just add a new file. Add new item. We want JSON, right? Okay, you can even say file new JSON schema file. Test.json. And boom, check that out. This is like a very long, pretty ugly URL, right? But that's okay. We don't really care. So now when I type, see, I get my IntelliSense, just like we would have expected. So super simple way of doing that. Let's see here. Test JSON. So JSON schema selector. And maybe you didn't see that, but the original one was had different casing. It was JSON all capital like that. So that's what I mean when I say that some of these APIs are not public for a good reason, right? Because they're subject to change. So how long ago did you make Schema Store? I made Schema Store, I don't know. What is it, 2020, 2030? Probably 7 years ago. Yep. Okay, so when we are dealing with a private API, you're going to have to go and just copy that DLL. And what we're going to do is that we're going to go here to where I'm going to open this folder. So here's where our solution is. I'm going to add a new folder called lib, like that, and paste it here. And then I'm going to take, and I'm going to remove the references to that internal API, to those. And I'm going to browse. And what do we call it? Here, repos. Here, lib, that one. Okay. So now that should light up again. Okay, and then I have to do one very important thing. And this is extremely important. When you are doing something like this, when you are coding against an internal API, first of all, you probably can't be backwards compatible. So you support whatever, only one version of Visual Studio, in this case 2019. Another thing is you can, but you should never ship that library with your extension. So let's just compile this. Let's do a rebuild just for the fun of it, because that's super fun. And then we go and we take a look at our bin, debug. And so you can see here it outputs it right here, but even worse, it puts it inside our v6 container. So we want to make sure, we want to do F4, and we want to say copy local, false. False. Then let's do a clean, and we do a build. And now, you can see that we have a much, much, much smaller here. And so why is this? Why do we have to do this? Well, because, and this is like a general concept in Visual Studio here, we should never ship. There's a few caveats to this, and I can talk to them afterwards. But generally speaking, almost 100% of the time, Visual Studio is going to, already has these DLL files in it. And so you shouldn't ship it, right? Because it's already there. So your extension is going to be much heavier because you ship them, and there's no reason to keep the download as small as possible. So that's one reason. Another reason is, and this is the real reason, your version of that DLL that's in your v6 could collide and conflict with whatever the official one is that's in that version of Visual Studio that your users already are using. And so that's the real danger, right? So you never want to have that happening. So never, ever do that. There's only one exception that I know, and that's when we're dealing with single site generators, because they don't have what's called binding redirects. And, they still don't have them, and they never had them. And I don't know why, because they're compatible. But it means is that if you want to support more than one major version of Visual Studio and using single site generators, in that case, I think it's okay to ship the lowest version of the single site generator DLL file in your v6. And that works all the way up because the API is the same. So, yeah. Can you compose schemas, several schemas for different parts of your JSON? Yes, but maybe not the way you think. Okay, so I think we answered the question of how to ship your extension with Visual Studio. And I still have that story to tell, and I will tell you afterwards. Okay, so if let's say that you have a section of your schema that you want to have defined by a different schema. Can you do that? Yes. So where's our schema file? So let's say here we have properties. Let's do another one called, let's actually go online and find a schema. Let's just use app settings. Let's use this one. So now I should be able to say, okay, I'm going to create a property here called app settings. And inside that, I want everything in there to come from that other schema. So I just do ref. And I do believe I need to do this. Okay. So in my test JSON, I should be able to say app settings. And really, I don't get anything. Oh, because it's from app settings, and then it's properties. There's one called properties here, right? Definitions. Oh, there's only pattern properties. Okay, so this was the worst example I could find. Oh, so let's just do a pattern property. Web optimizer. So if I go in here and I say web optimizer, do I get something? No. Oh, what happened? Let's just find another one. App settings was the worst one. This one, no. Oh, no, it's an array. Wow. My browser is struggling here. What's a simple one? This one I think I did back in the day. Okay. This one I did, yeah, back in 2013. That one. Okay. And this one has, in fact, properties. Okay, so this property should just grab for properties. Is that even a thing? This might not work. I might have done that wrong. Right click and say reload schemas, which you don't have to do locally, but that reloads the cache. Oh. No, here. I did something wrong. So app settings, it's a type. Type of app settings is object. And its properties, here we go. This is how to do it. Is that of properties. I think we're getting there now. Yes. And so now I get options. Now you can, so you see that? So my original schema can include more. Was that a typo in Web Optimizer? Maybe. So I hope that answers the question about if I can compose schemas for different parts of the same JSON file. So you can have multiple different JSONs. Yes, for sure. Okay. Before I get into my story, do we have any more comments I haven't answered yet? I don't think so.
No, I think you're looking good.
Thank you.
Oh, jeez.
So story time. We need like intro music where I like do like something like that, you know, while there's some soft music playing in the background. Let me tell you about the time. I think it was the year of the Lord 2013. Anyway, it was in 2013. Actually, it was in 2012. So what happened was JSON schemas didn't really exist at the time. So there was json-schema.org, I believe it's called, which was the official JSON schema working group, which was more or less kind of dead at the time. So there's been some effort. They had like 4 drafts that they had created, but it was a little bit of an abandoned project. Nice. It was a little bit of an abandoned project, and we had this thing on the web team on Visual Studio. So I was on the team that did, you know, all the HTML, CSS, all the web tooling for web in general, but for ASP.NET as well. And that was at the time when we started doing .NET Core. At the time, though, it wasn't called .NET Core. So I don't know. This is some trivia for you if you don't remember that far back. In the very beginning, it was called DNX. Okay, so DNX was what became .NET Core, and it was sort of just the name that we used. And back then, there was no project files. There was no CS_proj. Instead, there was something called project.json. Remember that? And that was a wonderful idea, wonderful concept. It kind of didn't work out in the end, but for quite a while, that was the way we did everything. Was using project.json. And so at that time in Visual Studio 2012 and 2013, there was no JSON experience at all in Visual Studio. It was just plain text. There was no colorization. There was no nothing. And I've been wanting to have a JSON editor for a long time in Visual Studio, but but that's kind of expensive to implement a whole new language, right? That's not something you do in one sprint, let's say. It's a much longer horizon on stuff like that. So it was hard to get prioritized and get sign off. But then, the need came for writing good tooling for Project JSON. And so that was our in, and we jumped on it. And so I started immediately figuring out what to do. And I learned about this thing called JSON Schema because we needed to have IntelliSense and validation, right? And so we know the concept from XML. XML schemas had existed for a long time. So we were like, well, what is the equivalent of that? Oh, and by the way, it's also schema files that drive our HTML editor and CSS editor. So it's like a known concept. And XML, they're actually written in XML, those HTML and CSS schemas. Anyway, so we looked at JSON schema, and it was abandoned at that time. But we kind of started sending some pull requests. We looked around a little bit, and we decided that it was the right implementation for us. And there's a few related technologies. There's something called, oh man, I don't even remember, but JSON reference. So the thing I am doing right here, where I reference using this. Here you get IntelliSense. Check this out, by the way, how crazy this is. You get IntelliSense for a file that lives in the cloud on this URL. I can go into the properties. Now Visual Studio looks in that file, parses it, and offers me the path. So this is called JSON path, I believe. How amazing is this? So I'm slashing my way into an online file. So it's absolutely amazing. Anyway, so JSON path was another thing. And so once we started putting the pieces together, we were able to ship the first version of the JSON editor in Visual Studio 2013, update 2, I believe it was. That was back when we had, or service pack 2, no, update 2, I think it was called. And I think it was the next update, we had the schemas support ready. And it became pretty apparent pretty early on that for this to be fully successful, we needed a more general approach to dealing with JSON schema files. It was a relatively expensive thing to write a whole JSON editor, and if all we had was IntelliSense for project.json, we felt that that was not a very limited capability, and so we wanted to generalize the support, the IntelliSense and validation support for project.json, such that anyone could write a schema file, could write IntelliSense and validation basically for any other JSON format, not just project JSON. And so that's how we came to look at the JSON schema. And I also knew that in order for this to really make a difference, Visual Studio had to know about all these schemas. And so how do we do that? Well, that's how schemastore.org was born. And so schemastore.org was basically just this idea of collecting schemas. So in the beginning, I just wrote them all. It was basically me and a guy called Mike Lorbetsky at the time that we built all of it. He was the engineer on it. I was the program manager. And I wrote all these schemas. I don't know anyone else. I might be the person in the world, or at least probably top 10, that has written most JSON schemas of anyone on this planet. Because in the beginning, I found all these common things, right? Package.json that NPM used, which we also used at the time for ASP.NET. Bower.json. And then there was all the Azure things, and there was more and more things came in, like, oh yeah, that's an established web form or a JSON format, and so is this over here, and And so it kind of started snowballing, and all of a sudden we had 20, we had 30, we had 40, we had 50 files, and they were all kind of just written by us. Some people already had schema files in their GitHub repos. And because of the way that I did Schema Store, I did it such that you don't have to host your schema file on Schema Store. You can host it anywhere you want. And in the catalog file, you just post a link to wherever you host it. And so then we added the Visual Studio's ability to read from that catalog file. And so it started just to snowball from there. And then Visual Studio Code was born. And it came in, and you see here we have like 300 files now. It's incredible. It gets like multiple pull requests every day. It's by far the most successful open source project I have, but people really rely on this now. And it's, I'm pretty proud of it because JSON schema got a renaissance, or it got a rebirth, I'd say. And they got on the standards body, the one, it's not really a standards body, I guess, but the work group that work on defining the standards of JSON schema, got revitalized. It's now going stronger again. We're not really part of it. I'm not part of that team on the web team anymore. That would otherwise I would probably be more involved, or at least trying to help if I could in any way. But I do run the schema store still. It's still in my name. I host it on my own Azure instance, and so yeah, it's just fantastic. So I think it was a true success story, and it all started with Visual Studio. And so without Visual Studio, we probably wouldn't have JSON schemas today at all. Like, it probably would just have been a forgotten technology. And I think when you look at what we did with the editor, I used to do these Excel spreadsheets where I did competitive analysis and other, like, how good are what features are we missing for the HTML editor and whatnot. And I have this spreadsheet with all these rows of features, and I did the same for the JSON editor, and there really wasn't much out there. But it was so good that there was just no editor that could even get close to competing with the completeness of our JSON editing experience. It was just insane. And if you look around now, like, they've all caught up, right? So now you have great editor experience for JSON everywhere, across the board. But again, it started with Visual Studio 2013. So that was so that was the story of how JSON schemas became the way they did today. And I should probably say that this is the way I remember. This is seen from my eyes, and I'm sure that if you ask other people from other editors or whatever, they might have had, or the JSON schema work group at the time, they might have had other stories, or there might have been other things that happened. But what was visible to me at the time, that's the story I just gave. So that was the story about that. Do we have any more questions coming in? Pipe.json. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that sounds like an NPM module, right? It's part of a CI/CD build pipeline somewhere. Pipe.json. It has to exist. Let's see if it does exist. Oh. I should do a search in here. See, here's the old project JSON. I can't believe they're still there. Wow. Okay, there is no pipe.json. So Jonas, are you going to make it happen? All right. Project JSON. Let's see what you could do in project JSON. Definitions. I could do like a whole section on how you actually write JSON schemas. I felt like today was like about how you ship them, how you get started with them, and so on, but not like a deep dive into how you actually write them. But yeah, so cool. Let me just show this because, let me show this here again in case you need to take a screenshot or whatever if you want to do this on your own. So any final questions before the weekend officially begins? By the way, James, I'm going to a cabin for the weekend, so I'm pretty excited. Pretty excited. Nice. I like that. Getting away from the city. Away from the city. Well, I don't really live in the city, but we're going to the mountains. They got yeah. It's like a log cabin, but I think I don't know if they have like even bathrooms. So it's not really camping because it is in a cabin, but it's roughing it. They do have a outdoor hot tub though. So I mean, it's not really roughing it. Missing Vue.js in the JavaScript store. Yeah, the JavaScript store. So this was a failed attempt of mine, or it didn't lead anywhere, rather. The schema store here have JavaScript and CSS. Okay. So JavaScript used to be defined in Visual Studio, used to be by the IntelliSense for JavaScript. The JavaScript editor used to be defined in JavaScript back in the same time period, 2013, Visual Studio 2015. But it is no longer. And so I just haven't deleted these pages. CSS is also like, I've never had a pull request for any of these. It was never explained how to update them and then update your own Visual Studio. And so it kind of didn't go anywhere. And so this also has to be deleted. This is literally just for JSON. But I did build it out for more stuff. And I still hope, do I? I don't know. One thing I wanted to do was have XML in here, because XML is in the same boat that we have some XML files that have a certain file name that when you open it, you want to apply a schema to it. But Visual Studio's XML schema extensibility is like very old and not very good. So yeah. There's a schema for person as well and more. There is a schema for resume, if that's what you mean by person. It's in here somewhere. Resume. It used to be in here. There it is. JSON resume. So there's something called JSON LD. And if you go to schema.org, so this is another schema. There's a lot of schema and .orgs around. This is the Google Microsoft thing, where you go in and you can define like a microdata basically on your page, on your website. And there is, in fact, one called person. If you want to describe a person, you can do it with JSON inside, or sorry, JSON LD, which stands for linked data. You can do that as a JSON blob inside your HTML, or you can tag your site up with microdata, and you can achieve the same thing. And so search engines can index that in a really good way. So I don't know if that's what you meant by schema for person, but yeah, there's a schema for everything. Okay. James, what do you think?
I think you crushed it. Classic Mads.
Yeah, yet another one in the bank. How many have we done now?
It's a good question. Past episodes, there's a whole playlist for them.
Well,
aka.ms/playlists. I made it nice and short. /extensions. How long does it take me to type? Oh my goodness. 11. This is number 11. Well, no, sorry. Number 9 with 2 scheduled.
Really?
No,
we have only
9?
done?
No, 10. No, 10. This is number 10.
We have 2 scheduled.
1 scheduled.
Oh, I scheduled one for the week after, but you haven't scheduled on the YouTube channel.
Correct. So this is number 10. That's a milestone.
Wow. So 10 weeks minus, I feel like we skipped one. No, we didn't. We never skipped one.
I don't think so.
Yeah. 10 weeks. It seems like we've been doing this longer.
I know, right? So that's good. It's good.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And next time we're going to look at, what is the next one? That's the TextMate.
It is. It is the TextMate grammar support new languages. I don't even know what that means, but I'm excited.
This is going to be super exciting because we're going to learn how do we ship new support for new languages in Visual Studio. Maybe it's even languages we don't even have to define because someone else did it for us. Fantastic. Whoa. Yeah, I know, right? So stay tuned for that. The week after that, Jonas had a great idea. What was that, Jonas? He reached out to me on Twitter. You should do the same, by the way, anyone on the Twitters. And had a great idea for doing, no, it wasn't Java. It was, it was a tool window. We're going to do a tool window, see how we do that in Visual Studio, how they're kind of interesting because they are. So the next 2 shows are going to be great too. Okay. And as always, if you have suggestions for what we should go through, what I should demo, what I should research, whatever it is, suggest a feature, you see the URL on the screen right there. James has made a nice form that you can easily fill in, or reach out to me on Twitter directly. That works too. So until then, have a great weekend, everybody. Have a great weekend, James. And
thank you.
See you next Friday.
Bye-bye.
Bye.